In April 1961, the United States appeared to be invincible, particularly in the minds of American citizens. It had just inaugurated a charismatic young president, John F. Kennedy, whose new administration promised a new frontier for the country. They seemed to be more than a match for the great American enemy of the time, the Soviet Union and its communist government, which it sought to spread around the world. Then news broke about a disaster in America's own backyard, in the communist-controlled island nation of Cuba, in a place called the Bay of Pigs. A small army of Cuban exiles had landed in an attempt to overthrow the government of maximum leader Fidel Castro and had been swiftly crushed by the Cuban army. Hundreds were killed and over 1,000 men were captured. Nobody believed America's initial assertion that the operation had not been backed by the US government, which of course it had been. The entire thing had been planned and executed by the CIA with approval from the White House. Not only was the debacle tragic, it was downright humiliating for a country that was unaccustomed to failure on the world stage. When word got out about how badly the operation had been botched and how many senior government officials had been involved and were now pointing fingers at each other as to whose fault it was, the American people came to a harsh realization. Their government was not in fact perfect. It was capable of making mistakes and then trying to cover up those mistakes by lying to them about it. It was a pattern destined to repeat itself again and again in the following decades. Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, and the multiple scandals involved with the recent war on terror in the 2000s. In many ways, the US government never regained the trust it lost on that Cuban beach in 1961. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Edelman, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes. Subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about places and the history that made them famous. Let's get to it. In the 1950s, America had never been more prosperous or powerful. Its economy was booming. It had emerged from the Second World War as the world's foremost superpower, picking up the slack left by the European nations, which had all but destroyed themselves in bloody conflict. But underneath this happy veneer was a deeply rooted fear. The specter of international communism lurked in the shadows. The Soviet Union and its communist government had emerged on nearly equal footing with the US at the end of the war, a superpower that was diametrically opposed to them. There were now two spheres of influence in the world, with America and her allies on one side and the Soviet Union, China, and her allies and proxies on the other. In the past, these two power blocks would probably have fought out their differences on the battlefield, but this was no longer possible because both sides possessed nuclear weapons, a terrifying new weapon that promised almost complete annihilation of not only both countries, but most of the world's population as well. So instead, they competed with each other clandestinely, a Cold War, if you will, a conflict that US President and war hero Dwight Eisenhower was determined to win. However, an unexpected complication arose in 1959 when the government of Cuba, led by President Fulgencio Batista, collapsed, and the widely unpopular dictator fled the country on New Year's Day to be replaced by the revolutionary government of Fidel Castro. Initially, the unpretentious Castro, whose green military fatigues and scraggly beard became the symbol of the new Cuba, was a popular figure, not only in his homeland but in America too, as seen by the adoring crowds that flocked to see him during a visit to the US in 1959. But it quickly appeared to the US government that Castro's Cuba was going to be a problem for them. Castro told people he wasn't a communist, but he appeared to be steering the country in that direction. His right-hand men, Che Guevara and his brother Raul, were both closely associated with a communist party. Castro also routinely took advantage of the widespread resentment many Cubans felt towards the United States, driven in large part by the long-time domination of the Cuban economy by American businessmen, including organized crime figures, and the overall paternalistic attitude previous administrations held towards their neighbor to the south. Castro engaged in hostile rhetoric towards Americans and the American government, painting them as imperialists and colonizers, similar rhetoric to what the Soviet Union was offering. For Eisenhower, the emergence of a communist country less than 100 miles from the American coastline was simply unacceptable. By 1960, his administration had come to the conclusion that Castro had to go. The US couldn't simply invade Cuba and depose Castro by force. It would paint them not only as aggressors, but hypocrites, considering how loudly the administration had protested when the Soviet Union had done the same thing in Hungary in 1956. A more covert approach was required, and that's where the CIA came in. CIA Director Allen Dulles had enjoyed a long and distinguished career in the American government, and was considered one of the foremost Cold Warriors. He also had experience in directing covert regime change to turn a potentially hostile government into a friendly one. The man Dulles picked to direct the operation was his deputy director for plans, Richard Bissell. Yes, like the vacuum cleaner. Bissell, a Connecticut WASP with an Ivy League background, had first achieved prominence in the CIA in 1954 when he oversaw a successful operation that chased the president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, from office, ensuring a more America-friendly replacement came to power instead. He'd also been instrumental in bringing the U-2 aerial reconnaissance plane off the drawing board and into the air, providing the government with high-quality surveillance photos from high altitude. He was on the fast track in the agency. Insiders believed he was first in line to succeed Dulles as director when the elder man finally retired. The initial plan called for a group of paramilitaries, armed and trained outside of Cuba, to infiltrate the island and begin a guerrilla operation that would, along with other steps, bring down Castro. To make the operation look like it had originated from within Cuba, the CIA started recruiting men from the large group of Cuban exiles who had recently come to South Florida, having fled their homeland, for one reason or another, after Castro took power. It should be noted that none of the men involved in the operation at any point believed they were doing anything wrong. The CIA men believed, as did most Americans at the time, that communism was an existential threat to their way of life and the way of life of free people all over the world. Anything that could be done to curtail communism should be done, even if that involved instigating violent coups and even the assassination of foreign leaders. In other words, the ends justified the means. As a result, practically nobody questioned whether the planned operation was moral or even legal. There was one issue that might present a quandary, though. At the end of 1960, Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't be president anymore. Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy swept to the presidency in the 1960 election, defeating Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and energetic. At 43, the youngest man ever elected to the office. He'd also successfully positioned himself as being tougher on communism, and Cuba in particular, than even Nixon was. And he was one of the country's foremost Cold Warriors. Kennedy gathered around him a group of advisors that were similarly young and hard-charging, mostly New England blue bloods who'd left profitable careers in universities and large corporations to serve their country. Their platform was called the New Frontier, indicating that a new generation of younger statesmen were in charge. They were also mostly World War II veterans who were eager to bring the fight to what they saw as the new threat to world order: communism. Their first battlefield was to be Cuba. Relations between the two countries had dramatically deteriorated throughout 1960, culminating in the United States severing diplomatic relations with their island neighbor, closing their embassy in Havana, banning all American citizens from traveling there, and imposing a trade embargo. Castro, in turn, moved firmly into the Soviet orbit, openly embracing Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the UN and making a deal to import Eastern Bloc trade goods and weapons to his country. The Kennedy men were now just as determined as Eisenhower was to remove Castro from power, and so were the American people. The question was how to do it. The CIA had been working on their plan throughout 1960, and at times it had grown increasingly bizarre. At one point, it was suggested that a hallucinogenic drug, probably LSD, be smuggled into his food so that Castro would begin acting bizarre in public. Someone else came up with the idea of loading up Castro's beloved Cuban cigars with gunpowder or some other explosive that would blow him up when he went to light it. Seriously, these are like Wile E. Coyote plots. CIA agents actually made contact with mob bosses Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana in order to hire them to put a hit out on Castro. If these plans sound like something out of a James Bond movie, it should be noted that Allen Dulles and many other men working for their agency were avid fans of Ian Fleming. creator of Agent 007.
What a helpful chap.
But what they kept coming back to was the brigade of Cuban exiles that the CIA was training at a secret camp in Guatemala. By the time Kennedy was elected president that November, the plan to use these men as paramilitary guerrillas had morphed into having them conduct a full-scale invasion of Cuba, complete with landing craft, air support, and tanks. In other words, a smaller version of what Eisenhower had conducted at Normandy in 1944 when he was fighting the Nazis. It is often said that the CIA dropped this plan rather abruptly in Kennedy's lap when he took office, but this is not the case. The record shows that he was briefed on the operation at the very latest in November, possibly even as early as July 1960. The plan that the CIA eventually came up with was for their little army of Cuban exiles known as Brigade 2506 to establish a beachhead on the Cuban coastline, deployed in a position to fend off the Cuban army and revolutionary militia units that would be sent to oppose them. Then the opposition political leaders the CIA had handpicked in Miami would be flown to the site and declare themselves the legitimate government of Cuba. This would, in theory, trigger a widespread popular uprising against Castro among the Cuban population, who they believed were being held under a communist government by force. Castro's government would fall, and it would look like the Cubans themselves had toppled him, with the Americans serving only as happily contented bystanders. Of course, there were a number of problems with this plan, which we'll get into later. A number of people in the government weren't sold on it, including Kennedy. His chief problem was that he believed that nobody would buy the story that the US had nothing to do with arranging Castro's ouster, that America's red, white, and blue stained fingerprints would be clearly visible all over it. Above all, he wanted a lower-profile American presence in the operation, and under no circumstances, no matter what happened, would he commit American military power to it. This need for a lower profile is what drove the selection of the site for the invasion, a small bay on the southern coast of Cuba known as the Bahía de los Cochinos, which translates into English as Bay of Pigs. The bay, located some 150 kilometers southeast of Havana, sticks into Cuba's underbelly like a small aquatic finger, 27 kilometers long and 10 kilometers across at its widest point. Despite the unusual name, there are in fact no pigs in the bay. I know you're all very disappointed. The likely origin of the name is the presence of large numbers of queen triggerfish, which are known in Cuba as cochinos. The area of the Bay of Pigs is sparsely populated and isolated from the rest of Cuba since it is surrounded by the vast muck of the Zapata swamp, restricting travel to only a few hard-packed roads in or out. If the brigade could hold those roads, they would effectively prevent the Cuban armed forces from dislodging them. As long as they had enough supplies, particularly ammunition, they could hold out almost indefinitely, long enough for the Cuban people to rise up and join their revolt. Things began going wrong for the invasion almost from the start of the operation on April 17, 1961. As the landing craft approached the beaches, they found themselves hung up on a coral reef. CIA planners had assured them that there was no coral there, the first of several wrong assumptions made about the operation. The coral dramatically slowed down the pace of the landings, well after the original deadline set of having everything unloaded and the ships out of the bay by first light, when the ships the brigade was using would be exposed to the Cuban Air Force. The original plan called for bombing operations by old World War II vintage B-26 bombers painted to look Cuban, in the 2 days leading up to the operation that would hopefully destroy Castro's planes on the ground. But after the first bombing raid, which destroyed some planes but also caused an international outcry at the UN, President Kennedy made the decision to cancel further airstrikes at the last minute, which Bissell and the CIA believed meant dooming the operation to failure. Still, the ground operation went ahead, and sure enough, as soon as the sun was up, the surviving Cuban Air Force arrived on the scene and began attacking the landing. They strafed the ships bobbing in the bay with machine guns and rockets. One ship, Rio Escondido, which was carrying most of the brigade's ammunition, blew up and sank. Another, Houston, was so badly damaged that her captain ran the ship aground to prevent the men aboard her from drowning. The 1,300 men who'd successfully landed at the Bay of Pigs fought bravely, and inflicting an estimated 2,000 casualties on Castro's forces. But they were operating on a flawed assumption from the start. There was no chance of there being a mass uprising against Castro. In fact, the Cuban people overwhelmingly supported their leader, and most of those who didn't had already fled the country for America. The revolutionaries the brigade needed to overthrow Castro were in Miami, not Havana. It didn't help that Castro knew they were coming, thanks to his network of spies and help from the KGB. Anyone who the maximum leader even mildly suspected of plotting against him were rounded up in the days before the invasion and were either in jail or killed. Without air support or resupply from the sea, the result was inevitable, particularly once Kennedy resisted calls from his advisors to commit American troops to bail out the brigade. 2 days later, it was all over and the exiles fled for their lives. Most of them didn't get far. 118 men had been killed in the battle itself, and more than 1,200 were captured in the swamps, with only a few dozen managing to escape to the sea, where they were picked up by US Navy destroyers. More men would die in the harsh captivity they were subjected to afterwards. It was a disaster, with some pundits claiming that it was America's worst military defeat since the War of 1812. And it was an American defeat. Nobody believed that it hadn't been a US operation, just as President Kennedy had predicted. It was a huge embarrassment both to the country and the new administration. And supposedly, Kennedy considered resigning before being talked out of it. In the aftermath of the debacle, everyone was pointing fingers at each other, attempting to deflect blame from themselves for what had happened. The CIA blamed the Kennedy administration, claiming that the president's modifications, particularly the canceled airstrikes, had scuppered the plan from the beginning. Kennedy, on the other hand, blamed all of his advisors, including the CIA men. To the extent he blamed himself, it was that he had been stupid enough to be misled by them. In truth, responsibility for the failure could be equally shared among everyone involved. Multiple officials would admit later that they had reservations about the plan from the start, but held their tongue, afraid of being seen as weak in front of the rest. It was a textbook example of what psychologist Irving Janis would later call groupthink, where a committee of highly intellectual people don't share concerns about a plan because of the pressure to fit in with the rest of the group. Fairly or not, the axe fell hardest on the CIA. Director Alan Dulles, his deputy Charles Cabell, and the man at the center of the operation, Richard Bissell, were all encouraged to seek employment elsewhere and left the CIA. None of them ever worked in government again. The Kennedy administration, on the other hand, mostly sidestepped responsibility for the disaster, at least in the eyes of the American public. President Eisenhower also disavowed anything to do with the operation, despite the fact that he had ordered it in the first place. It would take decades for the true culpability of either president to come to light. The Bay of Pigs permanently poisoned relations between the US and Cuba. Kennedy took the defeat almost personally and redoubled his efforts to get Castro. Things reached a low point in October 1962 when U-2 reconnaissance revealed that the Soviets had sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, a provocation that sent both superpowers to the very brink of nuclear war. This time, however, the administration was able to avert disaster through skillful diplomacy, arranging a deal that included a pledge not to invade Cuba in exchange for Khrushchev and Castro removing the missiles. A few months later, the surviving members of the brigade, some 1,100 men, were released by Castro and flown to the US in exchange for a ransom of approximately $50 million in food and medicine that was donated from American companies. The Bay of Pigs may have also played a role in President Kennedy's high-profile death. Lee Harvey Oswald, a self-professed fan of both Cuba and its leader, may have believed he was doing Fidel Castro a favor when he shot Kennedy to death in Dallas in November 1963. Of course, since Oswald himself was shot dead soon afterwards by Jack Ruby, sparking innumerable conspiracy theories about the assassination of the president, we'll probably never know for sure what his motivations were. For Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs was his finest hour. He enjoyed even more popularity after his victory over the Yankee imperialists and would remain Cuba's dictatorial leader and a figure on the world stage for decades afterwards. He died in 2016 at the age of 90. A few years earlier, top-secret talks between the Obama administration and the government of Fidel's brother, Raul, led to the first thawing of relations between the US and Cuba in more than 5 decades, with the US reopening its embassy and extending diplomatic recognition to Cuba, and allowing American citizens to travel to the country under certain circumstances. The trade embargo, however, is still in place, though it doesn't seem to have impacted Cuba's economy the way the Kennedy men might have hoped. Cuba is today, alongside Vietnam, China, and North Korea, one of the last nations still operating under a communist government. In Cuba, the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion is an annual holiday, with Cuban leaders making an annual pilgrimage to the site of their great victory. The Bay of Pigs is a tourist destination, with thousands annually traveling not only to the museum and monuments, but also to take advantage of the spectacular natural scenery. Reef diving is particularly popular. In America, on the other hand, the memory of the Bay of Pigs has faded. It's often confused with the Cuban Missile Crisis the next year. In fact, if not for the unusual name, it might have escaped widespread notice at all in the US of today. Such is the nature of embarrassing national memories. However, the Bay of Pigs has left an enduring legacy on American politics. Never again would Americans think their government infallible, incapable of making mistakes. It was, in fact, the beginning of a pattern of governmental mistrust that would only get worse in the following decades, culminating in a crescendo with Watergate and continuing on even today, long after the end of the Cold War. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, give Ben a shout out in the comments, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the history behind some of the world's most famous places. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.